Azir is a very unique and interesting champion for many reasons. He was one of the first modern champions, released alongside Kalista and Rek'Sai during the beginning of Riot's more experimental era of champion design. He was one of the first champions to bring the entire event alongside his release with the Ascension mode that released just 6 days before him. He fell into a weird niche of AP attack speed that was, and still is today, very rarely seen, and in North America he ranked higher than any female champion for appealing visuals. But despite how unique and interesting he is, I think most people would agree that Azir has some issues that make him less appealing or flat out just frustrating to play compared to others, so this is what I want to talk about today, looking at what I believe Azir's issues are and how we could fix them. I believe Azir has 3 primary issues and 2 smaller secondary issues. The fact that he uses ability power, his W, his counterplay, him being a victim of power creep, and his passive turret gimmick. What I mean by the first is that ability power as a stat can't support AP fighters, and while AP Marksman could be supported, they currently aren't, which is kind of where Azir falls into with his W just being an on-hit with extra steps. And since I already did 2.5 entire other videos on the ability power issue, I won't reiterate here, so if you're curious and haven't seen them, then I recommend going to check them out. But one thing I didn't mention in those videos were AP Marksman. The reason I didn't mention them is because while I do think I have an idea why they were never supported, I haven't seen an actual comment from Riot or evidence to back it up, which makes it more of a guess than anything else. But essentially, the reason I believe AP Marksmen were never supported is because of the original idea or notion of what ability power was. Essentially, Marksmen were AD because they shot the enemy with something physical, like a gun, a bow, or a boomerang, which meant it made sense that they were doing physical damage, whereas AP was linked to magical damage through things like magic cards, fire summoning, and spirit orbs. It's why, despite Twisted Fate having a pretty good marksman kit, he doesn't go bot lane as an AD carry, because his kit is AP rather than AD, and there simply just aren't any AP marksman items that could support it. Meaning he ends up just being a burst mage like Azir, Teemo, and Neeko end up being, and pretty much every offensive AP champion. But of course, this old idea doesn't really make sense to uphold anymore, and it's simply just an unexplored area of the game that could be pretty cool to see. And unlike AP fighters that require a bit more work, AP marksman would actually be pretty easy to support because crit already exists and isn't tied to AD specifically, only being tied to basic attacks, which AP marksman would use through an on-hit type of ability. They even already have a few AP marksmen with Cog, Corki, and Kale, who fit into a weird spot of AP champions who kind of just build crit anyways, despite not having much AD in their kits. And current AD champions could even be pushed into AP with a bit more retuning, like Ashe, Ezreal, and Zeri. It would create a lot more creativity and diversity in build paths for hybrid scaling champions as well. For example, MF being able to weave an AP crit item into her build to adapt to the enemy building a ton of armor, or to simply just add more diversity and freshness to the game rather than them building the same item every game. And in Azir's case, he actually already kind of fits into the marksman role really well. Maybe he could use a small amount of change to his kit and a bit of retuning, but unlike others in a similar position like Neeko, Azir is already pretty much a marksman with his W, which conveniently leads us into the next topic. Azir's W doesn't apply on hit for some reason, meaning his basic attacks don't count as basic attacks for items that any attack speed champion would want, like crit or on hit. It also creates a scenario where his W hits for almost nothing early, because other similar champions like Teemo and Volley apply the on hit on top of the base damage they deal, meaning Azir is essentially just missing out on half or even more early damage on each attack, and then scales much harder because he has an artificial weakness early game that's artificially made up for later. Azir's W also has the issue of being stationary, which creates a significant power fluctuation, where if the enemy stands still or is CC'd by an ally, Azir is able to deal an incredibly high amount of damage, but if the enemy moves out of range quickly with something like a mobility spell, it's incredibly weak. The reason this is the case is because he needs that high damage when he can only get off an auto or two before someone walks out of the range, even without a mobility spell, because otherwise he would be incredibly weak. It creates an unfun balance of the enemy not having fun by getting absolutely obliterated by Azir sometimes, or Azir's W being completely useless sometimes. And while there are so many routes Riot could take to fix this, like rebalancing the Q to have a much shorter cooldown so that he can actually reposition them more than once or twice, I think a cool option would be to scrap the idea of making him an AP marksman altogether and keep him as a mage, making the Sand Soldiers more like a Zed clone that you throw around, maybe even throwing in a marking mechanic that makes the Sand Soldiers follow and attack the marked target for a second or two, when you do something like hit the enemy with 2 or more Sand Soldiers while queuing. Whatever they choose, just as long as they address the power fluctuation and clunky feeling of playing him due to them being stationary. And then lastly for the W is the really weird tuning it has. Whether to compensate for the lack of early damage I mentioned, or maybe some other reason, Azir's Sand Soldiers increase in damage based on level, which on its own isn't too weird, but if you look a bit harder, you see that it only starts increasing at level 10 with a pathetic 2 damage increase, which then increases by 5 for levels 11, 12, and 13, and then from there onwards, it increases by 15 per level for kind of an absurd amount of damage based entirely on scaling. It's essentially just artificially forcing Azir to be a late game champion, but the problem with late game champions is that it unnecessarily makes them less fun early for the person playing, and then less fun for the enemy later, because at both points someone's getting stat checked. And then lastly for the primary issues is his counterplay. It sounds weird to say, but one of Azir's biggest issues is that he has counterplay that the enemy can use. The enemy can walk out of his W range since it's quite small and stationary. They can block the E dash to stop it, and Azir's primary disengage through his E is also tied to his damaging spells, meaning if he goes into poke with W and Q, he's left without a disengage because it'll send him further into danger, not even letting him just use it for the shield while walking away. And don't get me wrong here, I think counterplay is one of the most critical issues with League of Legends, and something the game is severely lacking with, but in Azir's case, because he's the minority where most champions don't have any counterplay, it means he is straight up just a worse champion because the enemy can reduce his power while you can't. It raises the question, why even play Azir when you can just play something like Aurelion Sol? What Azir's counterplay does is make him more challenging as well, which is where I believe he gets the moniker of being one of the hardest champions in League, despite his kit being extremely simplistic and quite easy, because the counterplay that makes him need to consider his weaknesses and learn how to play around them, which provides a significant amount of skill. And it's a tricky situation. Do we take away Azir's counterplay and modernize him now, making him better in the short term while hopefully focusing on a system-wide counterplay patch, since they don't want to create another season 6 to 11 scenario all over again, where some champions are straight up just better? Or do they keep his counterplay and let him suffer in the meantime? If they do modernize him by doing something like making the Q root if they're hit with 2 or more Sand Soldiers so that he can actually get some autos in, I feel like if they ever did do a system-wide counterplay patch, it would feel so much worse than if they had just left him as he is now. But anyways, now for the 2 secondary issues, which are Azir being the victim of power creep and his passive turret gimmick. What I mean by the first is that over the years, mana has been largely removed as a limiter due to runes and items. CDR has been pushed much more heavily into the game, and mobility was power crept quite a bit, which are all things that directly or indirectly hurt Azir. Mobility is pretty self-explanatory. Azir's biggest weakness was always an enemy that could get out of his W range quickly, and the mobility power creep just made that issue even worse. And the CDR and mana situation is essentially just him being outclassed by other champions, who benefited from the power creep much better than Azir. Azir essentially just falls into the same spot Singe does, where he's simply just a worse option than many other champions due to how the game progressed over the years to no fault of their own. And then lastly is the passive turret gimmick, which is pretty much just that it's a very small and insignificant part of the kit that only takes away from the kit as a whole by taking up a slot. They need to give him just an update like Ashe back on patch 5.9 where they just deleted her passive, moved the old Q to her new passive, and gave her a new ability that made her more fun. The Sun Disc was neat when it first came out because it was novel, just like Azir's Spires or Ivern's Bushes, but now they just take away from the rest of the kit and make the champion less fun to play because of it. Maybe a new passive could apply a Sand Curse when you hit an enemy, and at 5 stacks the enemy is rooted for a second, meaning it kind of ties back into the example I gave with the Q rooting when you hit an enemy with 2 or more Sand Soldiers. Whatever it is, I think Azir would only benefit from losing the Sun Disc passive for something more interactive and that adds more depth to the kit. So in conclusion, Azir falls into the ability power issue, not being able to be supported and instead having his balance moved into bursts like other similar champions. His W doesn't apply on hit, has a power fluctuation problem, and has really weird tuning. He suffers from actually having counterplay in a game where very few champions do, and he was a victim of power creep, which both just make him a worse choice than other champions often. And his Sun Disc passive gimmick is just taking up a slot that could be used to make him a more fun and interesting champion. And that's pretty much it. Let me know what you guys think of my analysis and if there's a champion you guys want me to look at. I'm thinking of doing one on Akali since she was my first main and one of the most brutal reworks of all time, or maybe one on Skarner since he's apparently getting a rework soon. Either way, thanks for sticking around to the end, subscribe if you aren't, and give the video a like since it helps a lot.